Welcome back to our Sunday School series on the book of Hebrews. You're listening to lesson number 2, the Prologue, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Okay, let's do a little bit of review from last week first. The review should be easy because it's basically all one word, but let's start with who wrote the book of Hebrews? Unknown. Good. We're not sure, right? Don't know. When was Hebrews written? Unknown. Don't know. Okay, that's right. All right. But likely before 70 AD. Probably before 70 AD, because at that point the temple was destroyed and there's no mention of the temple or anything pointing to it being destroyed in Hebrews. So probably written before 70 AD. Where was it written from? Don't know. Where was it written to? Don't know. Okay, good. You guys this is the best review session we've had here. That's good. All right, good. Okay. Now, how about what's one of the major themes of Hebrews? This is something we do know. One of the major themes of Hebrews.
Christ is better.
Okay, good. Christ is better, Christ is superior, and specifically better than or superior to
every angel.
Right, and he's going to walk us through several things, and then all of that falls under the umbrella of the Old Covenant, right? The Old Covenant is inferior, the New Covenant under Christ is superior. Now let's take a look at the outline real quick, because I'm going to throw the outline up here every week so that by the end we'll have it memorized. And you'll remember, you've already noted that the superiority of Christ is important. So here's the outline. Christ is superior to angels. And that's chapters 1 and 2. Christ is superior to Moses. Chapters 3 and 4. Christ is a superior priest to all other priests. This is 4 through 7. Christ's superior priestly ministry. This is 8 through 10. A call to perseverance in the faith. That is 10 through 12. And then chapter 13 is the conclusion. So here's our outline that we're working with. This is our outline to help us remember the book, to memorize. And here's where we're starting today. Obviously, we're starting in chapter 1. So the overarching argument here is that Christ is superior to angels. And chapter 1 is going to lead us into that. All right, Hebrews chapter 1. Long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high, having become as much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. For to which of the angels did God ever say, "You are my son, today I have begotten you"? Or again, "I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son"? And again, when he brings the firstborn into the world, he said, "Let all God's angels worship him." Of the angels, he says, he makes his angels winds and his ministers a flame of fire. But of the Son, he says, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness beyond your companions. And you, Lord, laid the foundation of the earth in the beginning, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment. Like a robe, you will roll them up. Like a garment, they will be changed. But you are the same, and your years will have no end. And to which of the angels has he ever said, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet? Are they not all ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation? Halfway through the argument now. Christ superior to angels. So we're going to stop there. And let's go back to what's called the prologue here, the foreword of Hebrews. And it's the first 4 verses. Okay for me to finish out here? Okay. And the writer to the Hebrews, you know that the argument of Hebrews is all about Christ's superiority. And he's not going to delay on that topic at all. From the beginning, boom, he hits right on it, and he hits on it hard, that Christ is superior. So the prologue, you could add this subtitle to it. You can see how this is how I've got it on the handout. A little play on words here between verses 1 through 4 and 5 to 14. That in the prologue, the author is making the case that Christ is the superior word. All right, and then the rest of chapter 1 is the author's going to use the word to prove that he is the superior Christ. And so in the prologue, we get this beautiful, theologically rich, deep 4 verses all about Christ's person and work, who he is and what he does. And let's start making a few observations and notes. First of all, as he jumps into this argument straight from the beginning, there's no welcome or greeting about who the author is. He starts off by saying, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. Who's he talking about when he's talking about prophets? Who are the prophets that he's talking about?
Moses,
Isaiah.
Old Testament.
Okay, good. So you got it. It's not just the collection of books that we refer to as prophets. Those are included. But when he's talking about prophets, he's going all the way back. Noah, Abraham, Moses, right? Everyone through whom God spoke to us. So don't limit yourself when he says prophets that it's just the major and minor prophet books that he's thinking about. That's not what he's talking about. Because in his argument, after he talks about Christ being superior to angels, who's he go to next? Moses, right? And Moses is the preeminent prophet of the Old Testament. So he's already got in mind further back than the major and minor prophets. Now he says that long ago, at many times in many ways, God spoke to our fathers through the prophets. How did he speak to the fathers through the prophets? What's he talking about? What are some ways?
Well, Moses had to burn the bush.
Okay, and what's that called? That God would have... what's that?
Theophany.
Yeah, you got it. Okay, so a theophany where God appears to a prophet in some way. What else? How else did he speak?
Dreams.
Dreams, good. What else? Visions, good.
The law.
What's that?
The law.
Okay, good. So, and how was the law given?
To Moses.
To Moses.
How?
Cards and stuff.
Okay, so both here and then here also. Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So long ago, at many times and ways, God spoke to our fathers through the prophets. And then in verse 2, there's this conjunction here. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. So there's a contrast being drawn here. That God spoke this way long ago at many times and in many ways. But in these last days, he's spoken to us by his Son. So let's make a few notes about verse 2. First, what is this period of time that the author is talking about? Okay? So the author is saying, in these last days, God has spoken to us by his Son. And it does include that. Go back just a little bit further.
Go back a little bit.
Just a little bit further. Just, Carrie said, when Christ rose from the dead. That's right. Yeah. So obviously his own ministry is included in that, right? So at Christ's first coming,
John 1, in the beginning was the Word.
well, that's a little too far back. You're right. You're right, Shelley, that Christ is present there. But what the author is saying is that in these last days, God has spoken to us through his Son. So what the author has in mind with last days, all right, this is going to run contrary to the common understanding of what this phrase means. That when this author means this, and most often this phrase is used in Scripture, what we're talking about is this entire period is considered the last days. So when people ask, do you think we're in the last days? Yeah, we've been in them for 2,000 years. Okay, that's how Scripture uses this phrase, last days. And we have a great example here. Because the author, who's writing at probably before 70 AD, is saying, in these last days, God has spoken to us through his Son. Okay, so that's the first note you ought to make about verse chapter 2, that phrase in Scripture most often is referring to from Christ's first advent to his second advent, that entire period of time. Okay, now, the next thing we want to note with this contrast is that this conjunction here sets Christ and the way God is speaking to us in contrast to the way God's speaking back here. So let's work this out a little bit. What is being said here that the author is saying God spoke this way, but now he's speaking through Christ? What is he saying about back here? It's done. He's not speaking like this anymore. He doesn't need to, as he's spoken here through Christ.
There's a little overlap because John the Baptist was considered a prophet.
Yeah, and even the apostles are going to continue to have dreams and visions, right? But until the apostles are done, there's that overlap going on there. Then this fades away, and Christ is preeminent, right? This is the way that God speaks to you and to me and to his people. So what we're seeing, remember, the author is talking about the inferiority of the old covenant and the superiority of the new covenant. Here's one way that implicitly starts to show that. Long ago, God spoke to us in this way, but in these last days, he's speaking to us, or has spoken to us through his Son. Now, what we're going to see from the end of verse 2 on through verse 4 is a breakdown of Christ's person and his work. Breakdown of Christ's person and his work. How is he the superior word? Because what the author is saying in verse 2, in these last days he's spoken to us by his Son, that's the period. And long ago and in many times, in many ways, he's spoken to us in all these ways. And in his last days, he's spoken to us by his Son. Boom. We don't need anything else. He's spoken to us in the better and final word of Christ. Okay? So now that he's spoken to us through the better word, the final word, the superior word of his Son, who is this that God speaks to us through? Right? That's what the author's trying to pull out. Because you'll remember from last week that probably the audience of the letter to the Hebrews are Jewish Christians who are in danger of falling away from Christianity back to reverting to some form of Judaism, most likely because of some persecution that's breaking out against Christianity. So they're wanting to probably pull back and move back into what's comfortable and familiar. And so the author's saying, grabbing them, get back here, look at who Christ is and what he has done. And so that's what we're going in 2, 3, and 4, is Christ's person and his work. So let's pull out some things that the author says about Christ here. In verse 2, it says, God has spoken through his Son. All right, now this describes a specific office or job title, you could say, What office or job description does this describe?
Prophet.
Yeah, all right, good. So we see that Christ takes on the role of, or the office of prophet, right? And in the past, God spoke through the prophets. Now he's speaking through Christ, the superior prophet, right? And we're going to see this threefold office of prophet, priest, and king explode in chapter 1 of Hebrews. And here's the first thing in verse 2. God's spoken through his son, so that means that he's a prophet, and he's a superior prophet, as we'll see later on in the book. The second thing that he says is that we should make the note that he is God's son. And what we'll see, both of these are from verse 2, what we see is that Christ is divine, yet distinct from the Father. And so we see he's the second person of the Trinity in verse 1. And we see this doctrine begin to flow out naturally from Hebrews chapter 1. That the Son is divine, yet distinct from the Father. So when we talk about the Trinity, that we see this personhood of the Son here. All right, so who is the Son? And is the superior prophet. He is divine, yet distinct from the Father. In verse 2, he also says that he's appointed the heir of all things. Okay, that's also in verse 2. What do you do with this? That he's appointed the heir of all things. Wasn't he always? Or was he not always the heir of all things? What is the author doing here with this verb? Because to appoint means to set or to lay in place, or to say, you're here and now you're there. I'm appointing this for you. So what's the author doing that now Christ has appointed the heir of all things?
It's recognized now by citizens of this kingdom.
Okay, and why is it recognized now by citizens of this kingdom? What has happened?
He died.
Yeah, that's right, his work, right? What Christ has done has been accomplished, right? In time and space. From eternity past, the plan for him to come and die on the cross, that's done now, right? He's done. So this speaks to the work of Christ, right? Because he has come and accomplished what was preordained and foreordained before the foundation of the world, that has come and gone and passed. He has been appointed the heir of all things. So that was his mission. He has accomplished, and as such receives the reward for accomplishing that which was determined beforehand. So he's appointed the heir of all things. So we see here the person of Christ, and we begin to see the work of Christ come out already in verse 2. Also in verse 2, we see that the world was created through him. So Shelley, this is where you were taking us earlier. The world was created through him. So what is the author saying about Christ?
From the beginning.
Boom. Yeah, this is a testimony to Christ's divinity. He created all things. And this word, I put this in quotation marks here. The Greek word here is actually ages, not world. This world, when we see this word in English, we're thinking, right, the physical creation, the world. But the Greek here is the ages were created through him. Time, space, history, everything that you can imagine is created through Christ. There's nothing that was not created through him. Okay? And so we see here, again, a testimony to his person that he is divine, and through him all things were created. So this is just from verse 2, these first four things that we can pull out that the author's trying to make sure that we get from the beginning. Who is this? That is superior. Christ is the prophet. God has spoken to us through his Son, and that's the ultimate final word spoken to us through his Son. He is called Son. He is divine yet distinct. His work has been accomplished, and he's appointed the heir of all things, and the ages were created through him. The world, all that exists, was created through him. Just from verse 2. So that already, in just one verse, he's already said a lot to us about who Christ is and what he's done, right? Okay, so now let's look at verse 3. Verse 3 says, He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty on high. All right, that's a cram-packed full verse of some really deep truths here. So let's go by some important key words. Number one, what does it mean that Christ is the radiance of the glory of God? Okay, what does this word mean? You'll remember that what's the infallible rule of interpretation of Scripture? Scripture interprets itself. Guess what? This word is only used once in all of Scripture. There's a specific word in Latin that we use called hapax legomenon, which means the only time this word is used in all of Scripture. So it's hard to go elsewhere in Scripture to figure out exactly what this word means, as far as doing a word study is concerned. But this word in the Greek means shine, or brilliance, or effulgence. One definition was brightness to the extreme. I liked that definition there, brightness to the extreme. So think for a second, if you can take us somewhere in Scripture where we see this idea of brightness, of to the extreme, of shine, of effulgence. And, okay, tell us about that, Beth. What about there?
His face shone when he came down, and the people didn't want to go up because they didn't want to die or shine.
Right, exactly.
He had to put a veil over his face, otherwise he would have blinded people.
Sure.
By the radiance that was reflected from
Yeah, and that's just a reflection of God's radiance, right? That's in Exodus chapter 34, if you want to look at it later. But Moses spends time with God, and when he's done spending time with God and he comes to the people, his face is shining in radiance and brightness and effulgence. And the people don't want to look at him, and they say, put a veil on your face. We don't want to look at you because it's so incredible what's happened there. So that's a great place to go. What about recently in our last study, was there an example from Daniel you can think of where there's this brightness or effulgence?
Describe the Son of Man? That's my understanding.
Not the Son of Man portion. Yeah, you're right. It is the angel. I think, Renee, I see you pointing to clothes, Lynn. Right? Remember, it's in Daniel chapter 10. The angel comes to Daniel to help him understand this final vision. And Daniel describes the angel as clothed in white linen and has gold about his waist, and his eyes are like fire and his feet are like burnished bronze. All of these things describe this glory, this bright effulgence and splendor that comes from the angel, which again is only merely a reflection of God's glory. Because the angel has come from the presence of God, and just by spending time in the presence of God, he reflects and radiates the splendor and effulgence from the Lord himself. So that's the angel. That's Daniel 10.
When I first saw that, I think of the angels coming to the shepherds.
Okay.
Is that...
Sure. Well, tell us about it a little bit more, Daniel. Yeah.
When it says the radiance of the angels, appearing in the field
Right,
to
good.
the shepherds, which is, totally overwhelming, something that they, was way beyond anything that they got, way beyond any normal, heavenly light.
Yeah.
Might have shown,
That's great. That's another good example of the shepherds there, because
Transfiguration.
in the Transfiguration, okay, what happens there?
Well, they don't ever want to leave because of the glory and
Sure.
the light and the...
Right, and the name of what's happening there is the Transfiguration, which means that Christ transfigures or changes into this glorious radiance, right? And so good Transfiguration you got there. And then the last place, so you can see, what's being said here, even though this word only happens once in the New Testament. You know what's going on because we see it happening throughout Scripture.
And the difference though is that with like the angels, they're reflecting God's glory.
Right.
But when it's on Christ, it is God's glory.
Yes, exactly. And what we see here, for example, so this is the Transfiguration. But what we see here in Daniel 10, John takes and applies specifically to Christ in the book of Revelation, chapter 1. Right? So the language used about the angel in Daniel 10, white linen, eyes of fire, burnished bronze, gold, all this kind of stuff, John describes Christ in that way, but in a more splendid, magnificent way. And so it's not just the reflection of what the angel reflects about God, but in Revelation chapter 1, we see Christ himself in his radiance described that way by John in the book of Revelation. So, Christ is the radiance of the glory of God. And then we have to talk about the word glory for a second. So I'm going to erase up top here. I'm going to erase verse 2 here. But I'll leave radiance up there. Now, this word corresponds in the Greek New Testament, it corresponds to a Hebrew word that means, it's used in the Old Testament for glory, but the literal translation of it is heaviness or weightiness. So when we talk about God's glory, there's a weightiness or heaviness or awe to God's glory. That's what the word in the Hebrew means, that's heavy. Or like glory. So it's the Greek word glory. So from where we get the word doxologies, doxes, glory, and it corresponds to an Old Testament Hebrew word which means heaviness or weightiness. So, like some of the stoners had it right when they would say, "Oh, it's heavy, man." That's what's right. That's right. It is heavy. So there's a heaviness to it, weightiness to God's glory. So Christ is the radiance of the glory, the weightiness of God in verse 3. Now also in verse 3, we have another hapax legomenon, a one usage word in the Bible, which is, see if you can figure out what English word this becomes. I'll transliterate it for you. Looks familiar? Okay.
Character.
Yeah, character. It comes over into the English almost exactly. And this is the word in verse 3, the exact imprint of his nature.
Meaning God's nature.
Right, of God's nature. And so in the Greek, this is the Greek word for imprint, character. And this word's interesting. The history of the word is that it began to be used as a tool that was used for engraving something. All right, that was a character. A tool that was used for engraving something, and then it moved into the word used for a mold, right? Where you want to recreate something over and over again. You have a mold that you pour the metal into and it creates the same idol or something like that, right? So a mold. And then it becomes a stamp that is used to impress a seal or a coin. So what is this word telling you about what it does? Yeah, it's exactly the same, right? It's a tool for engraving the same thing, right? Yeah, that's right. And so when he says that it's the exact imprint of his nature, we should have in mind this idea of a mold or a stamp that's recreating exactly the same picture or the same image over and over again. There's no distinction or difference between them, is what the author is saying, or is using this word to express as far as his nature is concerned. And what is his nature? His nature is divine. That's the nature that he's talking about. Right? And so we have one person with two natures, and the author is talking about the divine nature of Christ here, the exact imprint of God's nature. So we see, again, a testimony to the person of Christ here, that he is divine in nature, yet distinct as a person. In verse 3. Now the word nature has an interesting etymology or history as well. The word starts by meaning a foundation or a support, something that holds something else up. It's the foundation of something else. And that then eventually moves into the substance or being of something, right? The very foundation of something, or the substance or being. So what God is, Christ is. The same in substance, equal in power and glory, right? So when we talk about he is the exact imprint of his nature, there's God and his substance is the same as Christ and his substance. And the author's making sure that you're aware that Christ is divine. There's an exact imprint of the nature here. There's no difference as far as the divine nature is concerned in verse 3. Also in verse 3, so we have radiance, we have glory, nature was the next thing we talk about here. And then we go into this phrase in verse 3 that he upholds the universe by the word of his power. So what we see is not only does Christ create all things, not only does he create all things, but nothing exists apart from him sustaining it. You don't take another breath. This world doesn't hold together. The ages don't continue unless Christ sustains it and upholds it by the very power of his nature. So that tells us a lot about Christ, right? He creates all things. He sustains all things. And what's interesting here is the English has the word universe. The Greek just says all things. Literally just says all things. And so the translators are trying to give you the perspective of when it says all things, it means everything in the universe exists and is sustained by Christ as he upholds it. And he does it. Now this should call to mind some other passage of Scripture. He sustains all things by what? The word of his power, which ought to take you back to
John.
Even further back. Where John's taking us there too. Genesis, yeah. Because everything is created through his word, and it's sustained and upheld by his word. Just by his word, it's sustained and upheld. Now the interesting thing here about another word is this word power. He upholds them by the word of his power. This is a Greek word. And you could really say it this way. Dunamis, which is where we get an English word from, dynamite. All right, that's where our English word dynamite comes from, is power in the Greek. So Christ upholds the universe by the word of his power. Okay, that's verse 3, but we're not done with verse 3. There's another important part of verse 3 that says, after making purification for sin. Okay? All right, now earlier God spoke through Christ, and that was a prophet. So what office is this? Priest. Okay? All right? So Christ is the superior priest. All right? The priests were responsible for the sacrificial system to signify the purification of sin. And so here we see the second office of Christ, already mentioned in the prologue. And then we're going to see the third office here. What did he do after he made a purification for sin?
Sat down.
He became king.
What's the exact phraseology here? Sat down at the right hand
Of the majesty on high.
Thanks.
That's talking about his office as king.
Yes. Okay, so we got priest here, we got king here. And what we should note about this is that when it says he sat down, there's two ways or two things you should understand about his sitting down. One is he's done in one sense of the word. What he has come to do, he has accomplished, and he sits down victoriously. I've done it. And I'm sitting down because that portion of my work is done. Now the second thing is that this is an enthronement for the victorious Christ. He has ascended and sat upon the throne. Right? He has ascended and sat upon the throne, and that's what the ascension was. It wasn't just that he just floated up into the air and everybody's like, oh, look, he's like, oh, there he goes. But he was ascending triumphantly to sit upon the throne because he had accomplished exactly what his work was. And he sits down, and he sits down at the right hand. What does that signify?
That's the place of honor.
Right, place of honor and the place of power. He sits down at the right hand of the majesty on high. And here again is this term, majesty, majestic. This points to kingship here. So we see Christ is a superior prophet, Christ is a superior priest, Christ is a superior king, And that's only a portion of what the author said in 2 verses about who Christ is and what he has done. This word majesty is an interesting word also. It's a specific form of this word megas, which is where we get mega, our prefix mega from. Megalodon is the biggest, greatest shark, right? And you have, what other words do we use mega with?
Megaphone.
Megaphone, right? It's the greatest, most powerful microphone or speaker that goes out there. And so when we're talking about this majesty, it's the greatest of great majesty, kingship, right? This isn't just some little thing that he's done, but he has risen and been ascended and sat upon the throne of the majesty on high, the greatest throne that could be sat upon. Okay, that gets us through verse 3. So remember, the author's taken us through in these 3 verses the person and work of Christ. And so we've already seen a whole lot about who he is and what he's done. And we got verse 4 here. And that says, he sat down on the at the right hand of the majesty on high, having become as much superior to angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. All right, here again, let's wrestle with this for a second. The author says that Jesus has become more superior than angels. But wasn't Christ always superior to angels? So what is the author saying here?
He gave up his to come to earth.
Okay, so, and what, you're right, Beth, you're taking us there.
Yeah.
Well, you're right, because the author's going there in just a second as he quotes some of these passages.
You know, I'm trying to think exactly where it is in Scripture, but it says that Christ was, I think was the word was used, was perfected through suffering. In other words, that he in one way, was sort of completed through the work he did on earth.
Right. Yeah, and that's what this is talking about. And we already kind of mentioned it earlier when he said he was appointed the heir of all things, right? He has become greater than the angels because of the work that he has accomplished, has been accomplished, right? Of course, he's always been superior to angels, but the author's drawing our attention to the work that Christ has accomplished because the readers of Hebrews are in danger of rejecting Christianity and going back to some form of Judaism. So he's grabbing them by the collar and saying, get back here and look at what Christ has done. But this phrase, having become, doesn't mean that at one time he was not, and then somehow he did become or grew out of something that was lesser. He's always been superior, but the author is pointing to the fact that he's accomplished the mission. He's done what he was supposed to do. And he's having become much superior to the angels as the name he has inherited is more excellent than theirs. So what name is the author talking about? I'll give you a hint before you say anything. He's already used it in the passage.
Son?
Yeah. Okay.
Because that's what angels can't be.
Yes. That's exactly right. So the name he has inherited, and you'll see throughout this passage already the emphasis upon heir, inheritance, son, right? All of that has to do with the work of Christ. It talks about the person of Christ, but we're thinking about the work that Christ has accomplished as the son and his inheritance and all that he is as the heir, right? Because he's accomplished the mission that he's been sent to accomplish. So his name is greater than theirs. You see where the author's taken us? He starts without even introducing himself to tell us about Christ, who he is, and what he's done. And he wants to make sure from the get-go of his argument, there's no doubt in your mind about who Christ is and what he has accomplished. Right? We see Christ in creation. We see Christ sustaining creation. We see Christ as priest. We see Christ as prophet. We see Christ as king. We see all of his work of salvation made clear in just these first 4 verses. You've been listening to lesson number 2 of our Sunday school series on the book of Hebrews, the Prologue, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4.